Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video.
Following World War II, the Allied powers prosecuted, sentenced, and imprisoned Japanese war criminals across the Asia-Pacific. From December 1945, all Japanese war criminals incarcerated in Japan, including those repatriated thereafter, were held in Sugamo Prison. Sugamo thus became a central site where these individuals grappled with their responsibility for the war and shaped attitudes that influenced their reintegration into Japanese society. Sugamo Prison was originally built by the Japanese Empire to hold political prisoners, but was repurposed by the United States in October 1945 during the Allied occupation. The U.S. occupation was predicated on the goal of demilitarizing and democratizing Japan to prevent the re-emergence of fascism. As such, the rules and conditions in Sugamo generally reflected these principles, although they ebbed and flowed throughout, especially following the occupation. Despite housing war criminals, and in the immediate post-war context of unhealed wounds and enduring hostility, conditions in the prison seem to have been far from destitute, even under American occupation. The Americans sought to use Sugamo Prison to showcase the humanity and liberty that democratic countries extend to their prisoners. Thus, the flow of information out of and into the prison was relatively unrestricted, especially the latter. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal took place on a highly publicized global stage and was extensively covered by the media. However, once behind prison walls, the fate and treatment of war criminals were kept out of sight. General Douglas MacArthur imposed a strict ban on photographing Sugamo's facilities, a policy that historians like Lindsay Powell and Chunmei Du argue created a paradox. The prison was meant to exemplify humane treatment, but visual evidence was restricted. Nonetheless, such rules prevented the prisoners from becoming unwilling subjects of photographs at their lowest moments and preserved what remained of their dignity. The prison, according to MacArthur, was intended to be a space free from the indignities of the growing swarm of paparazzi outside the gates. A former American guard reports that, before December 1948, the prison officials would have virtually shot anyone caught taking a picture of those cells. However, such a rule was not entirely effective in preventing American guards from secretly taking photos of where they were stationed and the facility that imprisoned some of the most infamous war criminals of the post-war period. These pictures served as valuable keepsakes that captured their daily realities and souvenirs for the guards to send to their families back home. In place of photographs, drawings became a key medium for sharing information. American guards commissioned sketches from prisoners like Tobita Tokyo, often trading them for cigarettes or lighter duties. These drawings depicting celebrity prisoners like wartime Prime Minister Hideki Tojo were sent home to showcase the guards' proximity to notable figures. For a 17-year-old guard, being assigned to Tojo was considered an honor. Prisoners also exchanged drawings as parting gifts, such as those given by Tobita to fellow inmates like Prince Nashimoto Morimasa upon release, serving as a way to bring the inside outside. Between November 1945 and January 1948, drawing was officially prohibited, but guards often supplied scarce paper and requested sketches regardless. Prisoners released from Sugamo were another source of information on the conditions inside the prison. In a press report, a former prisoner claimed that the prison was like a high-class apartment house and that the inmates were rationed more than 3 go of rice a day. Such reports sparked resentment among the Japanese public, prompting American guards to tighten regulations on personal belongings and incoming mail. As the war crimes trials progressed, stricter oversight was enforced to prevent suicides. By early 1947, external packages and mail were banned, though books remained an exception, freely permitted to inmates. Though the flow of information coming out of Sugamo was subject to censorship, the channels of information entering the prison were significantly more relaxed. When Yoshio Kodama, a Class A war crime suspect, entered Sugamo Prison in January 1946, he brought with him a sizable collection of books and continued to receive books in the mail from his wife. Prisoners also had access to multiple newspapers and thus had little trouble keeping up to date with events outside of prison. Kodama wrote in his diary in August 1946 that he could fully follow the changes that are occurring in the outside world, and that he felt he could understand these changes more objectively and correctly than those in the outside world. However, in a diary entry less than 3 months later, in November 1946, he wrote that those in Sugamo get only the vaguest sense of what is going on the other side of the concrete wall, suggesting that they still felt significantly disconnected from the wider society. In late 1948, the Tokyo trials drew to a close, and the occupation shifted increasingly toward policies that prioritized reform, ushering in a period defined by an institutional framework that focused on reforming the war criminals that remained in prison. This rehabilitation effort sought to prepare war criminals for reintegration back into Japanese society and was part of a push to affirm the justice of the trial process and prove that the occupation was doing more than just punishing. As such, prison policies began to place greater emphasis on freedom and education as part of the reform process. Prisoners had access to a wide range of books and newspapers from the nearby Ueno Library, as well as the free time to engage with subjects such as philosophy and economics. The men's eagerness to learn and advance their education further inspired prison authorities to offer even more opportunities. This wide range of rich educational experiences and opportunities was given the name Sugamo Daigaku, or Sugamo University. During the same period, under American occupation, a weekly prison newspaper called Sugamo Shinbun began to be published as part of rehabilitative vocational training. Though subject to censorship, Sugamo Shinbun facilitated intellectual exchange. Its front page covered global and national affairs, but criticism of American occupation policies or Tokyo trials decisions was prohibited. Initially, the newspaper faced post-publication review, with inmates required to submit translated copies and adhere to content restrictions. When these rules were violated, pre-publication censorship was introduced. In early 1951, between the 137th and 138th editions, the newspaper's staff was abruptly replaced, officially due to the expiration of their 6-month contract. However, some historians suggest the real reason was criticism of execution decisions for Japanese war criminals in the Philippines. The newspaper was later revived with new writers. English-speaking prisoners translated Sugamo Shinbun into the Sugamo Weekly News for review by American authorities, including the U.S. State Department and the General Headquarters of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. While freedom of expression was officially promoted, criticism of U.S. policies or the Tokyo trials was strictly censored. Notably, when Class A war criminals like Hideki Tojo were sentenced to death, or Nobusuke Kishi was acquitted in late 1948, Sugamo Shinbun did not report these events. Censored Japanese editions left blank spaces as a form of silent resistance, while English translations showed no evidence of edits. Interestingly, discussions of communism were permitted in early 1951, reflecting prisoners' access to books on communism and Leninism, despite prevailing Cold War anti-left sentiments. Thus, compared to the wartime period, prisoners faced fewer restrictions on the kinds of intellectual material they could engage with, but they faced new constraints on the opinions they could voice. In April 1952, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty came into effect and the American occupation of Japan came to an end, Sugamo Prison was once again under the control of Japanese officials, and prisoners' connections to the outside world grew exponentially. They were no longer subject to the censorship of American authorities, and had the freedom to criticize their continued imprisonment and post-war conditions. Many exercised this freedom to pressure politicians, the press, and the public for their sympathy and the release of the prisoners. Far from being censored, many prisoners harshly and openly attacked the Japanese government for what they saw as its insufficient effort to secure war criminals' release with the Allied powers in the peace treaty. They published essays and books to these ends, which were widely consumed by the public, and received visits from a wide range of high-level bureaucrats and cabinet ministers who offered their moral support. These explicitly political actions were highly publicized in the media, and prisoners were given platforms to voice their concerns and present their views to the Japanese public, helping to turn the tide of public opinion in favor of their release. Though many of these war criminals made these comments anonymously due to fear of being targeted by the Allied powers, who still retained the power to decide who would be released, censorship was virtually non-existent by this point. Prisoners in Sugamo Prison faced censorship of the information allowed out of the prison from the very beginning of the occupation period. However, these restrictions eventually relaxed, with some important exceptions, such as criticism of occupation policies in favor of a more democratic, reform, and education-centered approach. Serving as a model for how democratic nations treat their prisoners, war criminals in Sugamo may have experienced less censorship than the Japanese public, who had been subjected to a bureaucratic censorship apparatus that extended to every form of media and theatrical expression. Despite such restrictions, however, the prisoners and American guards in Sugamo found creative ways to bring the inside outside. Prisoners also utilized outlets like Sugamo Shinbun to exchange ideas among themselves and to amplify their voices. Further, once Japan regained control over Sugamo Prison, the prisoners were free to express their views as they pleased and had a wide-reaching platform through which to disseminate their voices.